Hi, my name is James Willow Delano, founder of Everyday Climate Change on Instagram. Welcome to Everyday Climate Change Interviews, where I talk to climate change photographers, environmentalists, and artists. I have the privilege today to talk to Ed Kashi of VII Photo. I'm going to talk to Ed about his uniquely humanistic style of documentary storytelling. He works in still and in short film. Ed is well known for his series Aging in America, his work on chronic kidney disease afflicting sugarcane workers around the planet due to the warming climate, but he's probably best known for The Curse of Black Gold, 50 years of oil in the Niger Delta. In fact, he was arrested by Nigerian military during his reporting, only reflecting his deep commitment to the subject. Having experienced something similar over the border in Cameroon, I can tell you it's no fun. Ed works for Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. If you like what you're seeing, please hit the subscription button at the lower right, and let's get started. So Ed, it's a pleasure to have you at Everyday Climate Change Interviews after all these years, finally talking in person. And you've been a steadfast supporter and contributor to Everyday Climate Change feed. So I'm very anxious to see the work. And what I'm going to do is basically step out of your way, let you share your work on climate change, and then we can talk about it on the other side. So please go right ahead and start with your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, James. And let me just share my screen here. And greetings to everyone who will be watching this. And James, it is lovely to finally meet you. I feel like we might have brushed up against each other at Perpignan once or twice. But all right. So what I wanted to talk about this morning, I just want to get this all up and ready to go. I've been a photographer, a visual storyteller for now 40 years, and in a career where I've really focused primarily on social and geopolitical issues. What I've seen has unexpectedly made me a witness and a recorder of the climate crisis and its impacts. As I said, this is not an issue that was ever on my radar screen really up until the last 5 or 10 years, and to a great degree because of your efforts, James, and with Everyday Climate Change, where you provided a portal for many of us to share work both from our archives and from work we're currently doing that do reflect the issue of climate change, a hotter planet. And but when I look back on what I experienced and what I witnessed as a photojournalist, having the privilege to travel around the world and tell all kinds of mostly humanistic stories, was the number of times that I did work about water, about water scarcity and the impact of the climate. So my awareness of this issue really began in the early 1990s. When I was working on a very large story for National Geographic magazine about water problems in the Middle East, but it reached a kind of visceral crescendo in this one moment. I think it was 1994. I was sitting in traffic in New Delhi in India, and for hours, and I realized that I was starting to sort of have like toxic poisoning from the fumes. And it was in that moment where, as I said, it hit me viscerally that there is a real problem here. Humanity is out of control in the way that we're consuming fossil fuels and the way we are really living our lives. And I know I'd interviewed back in 2007, I did a big story about a huge highway project in India. And we interviewed this Indian historian, and he said something so chilling, which is that if all of India and all of China become middle class, or major parts of their populations become middle class, which they have every right to achieve, but that means they all have dishwashers and washing machines and cars and refrigerators and so on, that he was saying, how can the planet possibly survive another 2 billion people with all of those consumption needs? So, for me, my biggest concern and my hope is that we can unify ourselves around this issue, and because it affects all of us, and so what I want to do is I want to share some of the work over the years that I've made, that I feel, whether I realize it or not, or whether the work was intentionally about our climate, in retrospect, show different aspects of what we are now living through today as well. So this first set of pictures from California, I covered wildfires. This was back in the late 1990s for the Smithsonian magazine. And again, this at that time was more of a kind of like, how can I put it, almost not a novel kind of story to work on, because unfortunately these fires happen all the time in California, but it was nowhere near back then to the degree, the size, and the tempo of forest fires that we now experience, not only in California but throughout the West. But it was for me a precursor of kind of what we were in for, and it's also, I've done a few stories. I did a story in China for the National Geographic on a first descent of a river, a tributary of the Yangtze River, and it was in those kinds of personal experiences where I realized the absolute overwhelming, awesome power of Mother Nature, and the fact that when she decides to do her thing, whether it's a fire or just the sheer power of water, we really are absolutely humbled by that. We can only hope to survive it. So these forest fires were really overwhelming. This is a scene near Redding, California, in the northern part of the state, after days of these huge complex fires burning. The whole environment was very dystopian view of things. Now, more recently, literally April of this year, I went back to Mariposa, California, which is in that region. It's closer to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, to work on a documentary film about this incredible young climate activist who's a student at Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley, and he is already writing legislation to change the laws of California related to climate and particularly the burning of our forests. Those young people, a guy like him, are what give me hope that there is a generation that has awakened to what's going on, and at least there are some who are not willing to stand back. Obviously, Greta Thunberg would be the most sort of famous example of that now. So I had the opportunity to cover what was called a cultural burn, where members of a local Native American community in that part of California, and this is something that they've done for millennia, they've always done this, which is to manage their forests. And the way you manage it is by doing these controlled burns. So besides the cultural ceremonies around it, which were wonderful as well, it's this idea of, and what was so beautiful about this experience was you had everyone from students from, college students from, agricultural colleges, University of California, Davis. You had members of the Native American community. You had just volunteers who are, actively engaged in the issue of climate, and in this case, sort of responsible management of our forests. And so what I observed and learned here was how they would gather all the underbrush and they would burn it off and literally create fire to prevent larger fires down the road. And for whatever reason, because I'm way less interested in assigning blame anymore, I'm much more interested in figuring out how do we solve our problems. Because when we point fingers and we try to assign blame, then we create defensiveness, we retreat into our corners, and this is an issue where partisanship, there's just no room for it, quite frankly. And I know I'm not alone in feeling that way. I mean, this is one issue which we need to come together on. So it was really interesting. And then you had like guys who worked for the like California Department of Forestry, where their job is to stop forest fires. So there was this beautiful mix of people, again, from the Native American community to young college students to professional firefighters to just people, concerned citizens. And they were all taking part in this cultural burn, or what is more often called a controlled burn. And they were learning about how to manage our forests. And for me, this issue, there's a red herring with the debate about climate change, particularly in the United States. This idea that if you believe in climate change, then you're against business, you're against capitalism. And quite frankly, I think that is BS. I mean, and it is again, it's a red herring. It's a way for us to get sidetracked in a political conversation that goes nowhere, instead of coming together and realizing that, and I think President Biden and other politicians and other leaders, and many corporate leaders feel this way, is that, there's actually an amazing opportunity to make more profit and create more jobs by pivoting, and pivoting quickly, not waiting to a greener economy and hopefully to protect our environment. In 2014, I proposed an idea to the New Yorker looking at the issue of, which was then what they were considering the 500-year drought in California. Yet again, what is this, 7 years later, California is experiencing an even more severe drought than what we witnessed then. And I had the great opportunity to work with Matt Black, a photographer who's with Magnum and who way back in the 90s had assisted me, and now he's this just incredible gifted photographer and author, and he lives in the Central Valley, and he has done his most incredible work there as well. So we agreed to collaborate on this piece, and again, we looked at it through the prism, because California is so massive. We looked in a part of the Central Valley where the sheep farming is significant, and particularly controlled by Basque and Portuguese immigrants who are now, of course, citizens, but over the decades have migrated to Central Valley of California and have developed many different agricultural practices, but sheep farming is one of their main jobs. And we wanted to sort of see, well, how is the climate affecting them specifically? And also the local community. This was a small community just outside of Visalia, California, where basically they've run out of water. And again, this is California, and it's 2014, and we're not addressing the needs that are emanating from this issue, whether it's increased forest fires, lack of water. Even just in the last week, there are stories that for the first time in history, California actually has a level of water crisis that they've never experienced before. Also, in 2012, I worked on another piece for the New Yorker looking at the drought in Oklahoma. It's all part back then of the same sort of massive drought in the western states of the United States. And I got the chance to work with Ashley Gilbertson, a colleague at VII Photo, another amazing photographer. And he came up with this idea that we would go to Bismarck, Oklahoma. We'd go to the place where Arthur Rothstein made the famous pictures of drought back in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl. And we wanted to see, well, what is it like there now? And in this case, we focused on cattle farmers, and how is the drought impacting them? So, over the years and more recently, my work has actually shifted to a more intentional look at issues around climate change, our hotter planet. In 2012, I was one of 5 photographers that was asked by Time magazine to cover Superstorm Sandy. This is a massive hurricane that swept through New York and New Jersey in particular, and just devastated communities, and especially along the coast. And I covered New Jersey, and here's some of the images I made. This is a car dealership that's submerged in water. My neighbor lost their home. This is a view from Jersey City looking at what was then the unfinished New World Trade Center, but that's ground zero across the Hudson River. And this is in Atlantic City. This woman's home was just devastated by the flooding and the winds. And this was another example to me. I covered the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And this was another example of just the awesome, overwhelming power of Mother Nature. And, we can't protect ourselves from these things. We can't build strong enough. Maybe we can build high enough to avoid flooding, but I don't think we have the resources to reimagine cities like Miami and New York, let alone the whole world. My gosh, Bangladesh and so many other places that are already being devastated by climate change, and it will only get worse as these storms get more severe and the flooding is increased. So I don't know what more we need as evidence to make us wake up and come together and work on this together, and not see it as a zero-sum game where we will lose something, whether it's jobs or profits. But in fact, we also have the opportunity to gain jobs, to make more profit, just shift the origin of it, if you like. And the big elephant in the room, and I've seen this because I've worked so much on the issues of oil and gas in Nigeria and the Middle East, and other parts of the world, is the oil and gas industry that, unfortunately, and I'm not saying anything that most people who are sentient and paying attention don't know, but that our politicians are truly in the pockets of the oil and gas industry, of the fossil fuel industry, maybe coal to a lesser degree now. And, the sheer profits that I've witnessed that the oil and gas industry make are, they're alluring. It's easy to become corrupt when you can make so much money off of these specific resources. But the toll that we pay in terms of the human cost, because in most of the places in the world where oil and gas are extracted, the people whose land those resources come from have a poorer life than they did 50 years or more ago, before oil and gas was discovered on their lands. Because generally speaking, those profits are not shared. And the infrastructure development and education and healthcare and all the other things that come with creating development in a civil society often do not come with the profits that oil and gas make. It tends to create a very corrupt system where also the local politicians are not beholden to their electorate because they have so much money from oil and gas. They can neglect the needs of their people. This is in Pecos, Texas. This was last year. I had the opportunity to work on a project for a Danish newspaper where I traveled from Los Angeles to New Orleans to look at issues in the United States in the run-up to our election, our presidential election in November. And this was last August, crazy hot. Pecos is in the western part of Texas, which is a massive state. Every time I go there and have to drive through it, I am reminded of what a massive state it is. It's also an incredible place. But, again, this is the center of the gas industry, but because of the pandemic and other, kind of economic issues of supply and demand, that economy has been decimated, the local gas industry. And this is the epicenter of the shale, fracking kind of gas industry in the United States. It might even be in the world. Anyway, so this is an image to sort of illustrate how it's sort of run down. Then we went to New Orleans, outside of New Orleans in Louisiana, where what's called Cancer Alley. This is an area that runs right along the Mississippi River as it goes out into the delta, into the Gulf of Mexico, where there are hundreds of oil and gas refineries and other kinds of chemical plants. And it is one of the most toxic places possibly in the world, but certainly in the United States. So again, I am not anti-industry. I am not anti-business. My God, we couldn't do what we're doing right now unless we had the electricity to do it and the technology. So, I learned a long time ago that, it's like people don't want redwood trees to be cut down, but people want redwood hot tubs. It's that kind of a thing. We need to kind of justify our sort of consumption needs and desires to what is the impact on our environment when we have to extract those things and process them. So anyway, for me, these what I call in sort of environmental justice hotspots are also a plague. They're a plague on our house, and surely we must find better and new ways to create the things we need to sustain ourselves on this earth without destroying ourselves, sickening ourselves, and destroying Mother Nature. So this is some work that I did in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. I made a book, Curse of the Black Gold. In 2008, I published that book. This was a multi-year project looking at the impact of, at that point, 50 years of oil and gas exploitation in the Niger Delta. It's the third largest wetlands in Africa, in the world, and it is really where all of the majority of the gas and oil that Nigeria creates comes from. And Nigeria is one of the 10th largest exporters of oil and gas in the world, so they're a major player. And the things I witnessed there just upset me and angered me and compelled me to continue to do this work. So, for instance, in this small village, the women of the village use the heat from the gas flare to bake their tapioca cakes. So I spent maybe 20 minutes there because this was a bit of a security-wise a tricky image to try to make. I was sort of trespassing in a way. And after 20 minutes, like my arm hairs were singed. I had this film of just sort of oiliness over me. And that was only after 20 minutes. And these women are going there every single day and working for hours. And then you think, well, how much would it cost Shell Oil to build a communal oven for these women? It's things like this that as photographers, as journalists, and particularly as photographers, we're face to face with it. It's not something we read about. It's not something we hear about. We see it, we feel it, we smell it. And it's hard to turn your back on these things when you actually see them. And what I've also learned, though, is while I might have an activist heart and a brain and a desire to be a part of positive change, I am not an activist. So it's so important in doing this work to collaborate with organizations or individuals, institutions, governments, foundations, corporations. I really don't care what the entity is, but as long as they're doing something to affect positive change, specifically now on this issue of climate change, I am so happy to be able to provide work or to tell stories that can help them tell the story of climate change and galvanize support, whatever it may be, funding for communities or legislative change. All these things are critical. One of the many things I learned in the Niger Delta project was how close the oil works are to where the people live, how unhealthy it is for the people. So there's this human impact as well. We're not just dealing with sort of the destruction of Mother Nature, the defacing in a way of Mother Nature, but we're also talking about the human impact, on people's health, on their well-being. In the case of the Niger Delta, on their ability to make a living, because traditionally they made their living and they gained their protein from the fisheries and then from agriculture. Well, those two industries, if you like, have been decimated by by 50 years of oil and gas exploitation. And now, of course, you have armed militants who are fighting back. When people have no choice, then they resort to violence. This is in northern Nigeria, where I was working on a story in 2013 about the impact of Boko Haram and the sort of Islamicist movement and Christian-Muslim divide in the north part of Nigeria, which is mostly Muslim. And this is just an image again that strikes me. This is one of the 10th largest producers of oil and gas in the world, and this is how these kids have to walk to go to school every day, burning piles of rubbish along a railroad track. I mean, this is unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable to the Nigerian politicians whose responsibility it is to look out after their people and to look after their land. and their resources. This is also in the northern part of Nigeria, Zamfara province, the highest the highest incidence of lead poisoning among children. These are artisanal gold mines. This is in Ghana. Again, what are we doing to our planet? We are consuming, even in a community in rural Ghana where the people have very little money, and we can say accurately, there's underdevelopment. There's still no mechanism for containing their garbage and what they consume, and this is all over the world. And James, I know you've seen this as much or more than I have. Wherever you go in the world, it seems we have these endemic problems of humanity kind of run amok when it comes to how we coexist with our environment, or not. This is in Madagascar. I received a pre-Pictet commission in 2010, and I went to work on a project about sustainable development. And these are corn farmers, and because of a lack of water, the continuing drought there, they have no crops. They're just burnt out. Their forests, 90% of Madagascar's forests have been burned or cut down. So, again, this creates other problems, not just for people in Madagascar, but for the globe, because these are, the forests of Madagascar help to be the lungs for our planet. In Syria, I was there in 2008, looking at a story about, just sort of what we thought were reforms that were beginning to happen under Bashar al-Assad in Syria. It wasn't an environment story, but I did go to the north. This is outside of Raqqa. This is before the civil war. And drought has become clearly one of the issues that sort of pushed the civil war to happen in Syria, because it changed, it created migrations of people internally. It caused all kinds of disruptions to the balance of their society. This is in Raqqa. That's the great Euphrates River, and it's down to almost a small stream now in the heart of the city, which was ultimately taken over by ISIS and was its capital for a period of time. And this is back from my Middle East water story in 1992, where the Bedouin in the desert of Syria, normally Bedouin are pastoralists, so they move with the rains, so that there'll be vegetation for their animals to eat and for them to be able to live temporarily. Well, because of continuing drought and the change of the rain patterns, they're now not moving around anymore. They're just drilling these deep water wells. That's what you see in this image. So then they can create their own communities. So not only is it changing their cultural or historical patterns of migration, but also, not migration if you like, but moving around, but also they're now sapping the aquifers of the deserts in Syria. So there's so many implications to human activity in terms of how we are affecting, unfortunately, mostly in a negative way, our environment, our climate, and the ability of humanity to really sustain ourselves on this planet. And I don't mean to paint such a dire picture. I mean, we're way far away from losing this battle, but I don't understand why we're not galvanizing an international movement, at the very least in the United States. My God, with all the resources and power, economic power we have, and technical ingenuity and so forth, why are we not banding together to stay focused on a mission that we all need to do? This is a refugee camp in Jordan, a Syrian refugee camp. So again, this is another impact of climate change, with the droughts in Syria and the conflicts it created. Many believe it exacerbated the civil war there. And so now, in some way, I've become a climate photographer, even though I know I'm not viewed that way. I don't view myself that way, but I realize that it is now one of the critical issues that we're facing. And as a visual storyteller, as someone who has really dedicated their lives to trying to figure out what are the critical issues of my time and how can I possibly tell stories or create images that will inform and more importantly now for me, create change. That has become a driving force behind so much of my personal work now. This is in Brazil. Worked on a project about sugar, and went to the area Sao Paulo state, which is Brazil's the largest producer of sugarcane and sugar in the world. Massive, very highly sophisticated industry and economy around that in Brazil. And for the most part, they've cut out the burning of fields, but this was one sort of, to me, like apocryphal image. It was almost like a Renaissance painting of sort of the burning of these massive burnings of fields that still do take place. And the current project I'm working on, which I'm now in my 8th year looking at, is the impact of chronic kidney disease around the globe, specifically the sort of equatorial part and the hottest part of our Earth. And this disease is impacting mostly poor agricultural workers. I've worked on this project now in Nicaragua, El Salvador, India, Sri Lanka, and Peru. And this is in Nicaragua, it's the sugarcane workers that are most severely impacted by this disease. And there's no question that it is connected to hotter working conditions and climate change, where people who are working, this is in India, wheat farmers in incredibly hot climate, not getting proper hydration, not getting proper rest, not getting shade, that they're developing a very unique form of kidney disease that is not connected to obesity, diabetes, or high blood pressure, which are the main causes of kidney disease. This is in Sri Lanka, where the local government in the one north central province is so alarmed at the incidence of this disease, they're starting to do blood and urine tests of primary school kids to try to nip this in the bud. This is a dialysis clinic in India. So, again, when we think of climate change and when we think of the climate crisis, we have to remember the human toll, not just the environmental toll. And I like to believe that the more folks like myself and James and other people, documentary filmmakers and photographers and journalists who are dedicated or interested in telling stories around climate change, that we can emphasize the human impact, because sometimes I worry that the environmental impact glosses over people's kind of, we're overwhelmed with too much information. It's we're trying to get on and survive in our own lives, and so it can be very hard to sort of grasp the enormity and the potential impact on ourselves and our loved ones and our communities of climate change. So one wonderful thing that happened in Nicaragua after years of working there on the issue of chronic kidney disease in 2020, right before the pandemic started, I was able to go back for the Guardian newspaper to do a story about a new initiative called the Adelante Initiative. And it's basically, it's gotten the large sugarcane company there to provide rest, water, and shade for their workers. So this is like 4:30 in the morning. The workers are gathering in buses to go out, be taken in the fields. But now they're being given these huge jugs of water, and they're being tested for their heat, for their body heat and their blood pressure. So there's this whole project and then bringing shade, these tents. So it's minimal cost to the company to provide these things. But what's beautiful is not only is the incidence of the disease decreasing, but also their productivity is increasing. So this is a win-win. And again, I'd like to believe that there are all kinds of these solutions, and this is not a high-tech solution. Water, rest, and shade. Pretty simple. So, it's incumbent upon us to find these stories and to tell these stories so that we can bring not only people together, but get the corporations and governments and the entities that really, in the end, control things. They're going to determine our fate, because it's up to them to either change the way they do things or continue on this course, which I see as a collision course that is going to be pretty ugly. So I'm at this stage in my life and my career, having had the privilege and the benefit of decades of looking at issues around our climate and our environment, and being able to almost in real time witnessing these changes that are taking place. While it's alarming and we need to be very concerned, there are also pockets of hope, points of inspiration. And the war is not over. We need to come together to fight it together. So last
quick question, Ed,
yes.
If I could cut in, there is that image of that measuring the man's midsection, and that caught my eye when I first saw it. What is happening there?
So here they're measuring his his heart rate. So they were doing all these measurements where before they started work, they do their heart rate, their body temperature, and their blood pressure. And then after they finished their shift, they take the same three measurements. So it was a way, again, this is part of the Adelante initiative, which was created by the La Isla Network, a small American-based NGO that has been dedicated to this, combating and dealing with this issue of chronic kidney disease of undetermined causes. And so, they're not only bringing the rest, water, and shade, but they're also monitoring the workers to try to get a better idea. They're also doing blood and urine samples of the workers in the field. So it's these mobile clinics so that they can compile data to try to figure out, what is also the scientific impact of these interventions.
Yeah, and also analog solutions to this problem.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. It does not have to bankrupt the company to protect the health of their workers, which they should be doing anyway, and also, voila, to increase productivity. So, in the case of the sugarcane industry, specifically in Central America or Mesoamerica, unlike Brazil, which is way ahead in mechanized harvesting, it's only a matter of time till workers like this are going to be redundant. Those jobs won't exist, because even in the poorer countries in Central America, like Nicaragua, they are shifting to mechanized harvests of, in this case, sugarcane, which, quite frankly, having seen for decades sugarcane harvesting, it's a brutal job. That if we can mechanize it, hallelujah, because it's better to not have humans doing that work. It's backbreaking and in some cases disease-causing work. So the last piece I want to share with you, and we have time to do this. Okay, so this last piece I want to share with you, it's a documentary film. This is just the trailer. It's called The Sacrifice Zone, and this is actually a film that my wife, Julie Winokur, it's her film. I was fortunate enough to be the DP on it, although we had many folks shooting in the course of the 3 years that we worked on this. But it's looking specifically at this one community in Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey is the largest city in the state of New Jersey, and it also, in this one area called the Ironbound, it is possibly the most toxic place in the United States. There are more Superfund sites in this one area of this city than anywhere else in the country, including a former Agent Orange plant factory, which is now, it was so polluted because the ingredient in Agent Orange is dioxin and it just does not break down. It's so damaged that they couldn't remediate it or extract it. They literally just created like a sarcophagus, similar to, but not to the same extent as what happened in Chernobyl, where you can't remove the problem, you have to just basically entomb it in concrete. So
I think they did that into the bay in Bayonne.
Wow.
As well.
Yes, exactly.
Nearby.
Well, no, this is the same. Yeah, this is part of the same complex. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm going to play this short clip, but this is a story about environmental justice, and it's happening all over the globe, where so often, and obviously this is reflecting the United States, so often the most polluting and damaging industries are placed in areas where people of color live. And so in this case, the Ironbound is a heavily Portuguese lots of Latinx and Caribbean folks who live there, and also an old African American community as well. So let me play this, and then we can talk.
Around our country, we're replete with examples of certain communities basically becoming warehouses for toxic facilities.
Most of the industrial legacy for the city of Newark lies in the ironbound. There's just so many things in a concentrated area that's less than a mile from where all the residents are.
You're not just breathing in one chemical at a time or one pollutant at a time. You're exposed to a barrage of pollutants.
We're the ones that live with the impacts of mass consumption.
People think you need a hurricane to do this. We don't. We just need a day full of rain. And not everyone lives this way.
We're seeing incidents of high levels of congenital heart failure, of asthma, and children having learning disabilities.
I can't call it anything else but a sacrifice zone. A zone that's been deemed these lives don't matter as much.
We can't keep sitting back and letting generations be affected by this.
To create change, you can't let anybody take away your power or your community's power. Mighty, mighty are you now.
Well, powerful work, Ed. What I love about your work, Ed, is the thoughtful nature, how you bring the human element into it. I think it delivers the message so much more powerfully. And I think that we have to be thinking about constantly recalibrating what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong. And that is something I think you're definitely doing right. I'm really interested in talking about how climate change is this shadow player, and I think by you doing humanistic stories, you introduce this shadow player through people's lives, and people can really connect with it. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
So that's interesting. When you say shadow player, you mean that it's not like directly. It might not be directly about the climate, but it's really looking at kind of an ancillary impact.
Exactly. Like, for example, it exacerbates existing problems. Like, for example, you mentioned being in Syria to cover water, but not thinking about climate change. But water is there. Water is chipping away, building that a bigger wedge between tribes of people, nationalities of people. You've got the intensifying heat in Nicaragua, for example, and how that's making people's lives more difficult. Sometimes it's hard to communicate to people. They know things are happening. Japan was green. It is green. It will be green. So it's very hard to get people to wrap their minds around it. But when you look at what happened here last week, okay, we had 6 weeks of rain, which is somewhat normal. It's hard to live through, but it's somewhat normal. Then we had intense heat to the point that they were basically cooking the famous koi carp. 600 died in the river near me. Nobody seemed to notice this. And this week, we're right back to flood. So Japanese are starting to get it. It's this, again, shadow player, and it's also maybe a developing world problem that is starting to affect the middle latitudes.
Right. Well, but again, when you've got this sort of mis and disinformation taking place, and unfortunately the very sort of toxic, misleading nature of social media, the way our media landscape is now, it's harder for us to come together and see these things all being connected, and that's what is upsetting and bewildering to me is with these sort of shadow player stories, if you like, which is a really nice way of putting it. I don't know, is it like the old metaphor of the frog in water, hot water? I think, I know it's so cliche, but it's the only thing I can think of, right? It's so, but at what point are we going to wake up and realize that these things are all interconnected? And, look, I understand that, humanity's touch in the grand, like, geological time frame is we're nothing, it seems. But at least in this period where we are on this particular planet, and there's billions of us now, and we're not going away, I do believe that we can affect change. Again, I'm saying there are these larger, environmental dynamics that are way beyond us, right? Like if a new ice age comes or whatever, we can't control that. But certainly we can control our impact on things. And I also think that's part of like human nature is our survivability. That in a way it kind of like asks us to step up to the plate and do something that we've ended up being really good at, which is to survive and to flourish. And for some reason, we're dropping the ball on this one. And I really believe, quite frankly, it's because of capitalism and profit motive and greed on the one hand, and then the way that even our democratic institutions have been corrupted by money, and so that politicians, whatever they believe, they will not act in the best interests of their own people, and let alone the planet. And then the misinformation and the disinformation that is being pushed by, again, sectors, whether it's ExxonMobil or it's a politician or someone who doesn't believe in this stuff. So it's a toxic mix, quite frankly, that stops us from waking up to these shadow stories, right? And I think of like the people in Japan. I've been there a few times, and I always feel like they're pretty aware of their environment, because it's a country and a culture that is so integrally connected to their environment. And you would think that, and also they're so educated and they're just brilliant people.
We also have a lot of natural disasters here, so they're primed and ready for sacrifice.
Right. So you'd think, you'd like to believe countries like Japan would be like, they'd be woke, that they would come together, and that also, unlike America, the politicians cannot get away with hiding the truth.
I would like to talk a bit about U.S., and you touched upon an era. It was my grandfather's era. When my father was born in the 1930s, it was an era I always wanted to see and live in. But what we have history resonating again, kind of rhyming. You brought up the Dust Bowl, and you remember in 1935, a dust storm made it to Washington, D.C., and that made a profound impression upon the elites in D.C. And this summer, we've had smoke from fires reaching you on the East Coast. And this visceral evidence of a crisis, an environmental crisis, really affected people. Do you feel that people are starting to really viscerally feel the effects of these fires and kind of getting a little bit, more serious about this? Lake Mead is down to, I think, 35% capacity.
Right. It's like what more evidence do you need to realize that? But I don't see it.
You don't feel an urgency?
No, but I witnessed the urgency among the people, like my tribe. The people that bother to stay aware of things and that believe in science and believe in the media, or at least do their due diligence to get enough information from enough sources that you can triangulate. And, there are massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. There was massive flooding in Germany. This is not fiction. This is real, and it's not normal. And so there, you have one sector of the population that is paying attention, that is upset, that is scared, and of a portion of them, like that young man who's a student at Berkeley who's writing legislation at the age of 19, right? But then you've got the vast majority of people who are either denying it, asleep at the wheel, or, to be fair, working their asses off trying to just survive. And so they don't have time to think about things like this. They have 2 or 3 jobs, so forth and so on. So, and then you have these elites that are kind of, they're just greedy. That's the only thing I can think of. They're not stupid. They're not aware. They're not unaware. They're greedy. And so they're going like, hey, man, we can still make billions of dollars in profit, trillions of dollars in profit from fossil fuels. Why would we want to give up that drug now? And so it's this terrible, terrible moment we're in, where we can't bring people together in the way we have in the past, in the way we have in the past. And this is a war, but it's a war that doesn't have to involve like shooting anyone or blowing things up. In a way, it's a war. It's more like the space race. Maybe that's a good metaphor, where nobody has to get hurt per se, intentionally, but it will promote the advance of technology and science and the way we do things, and learning how to, without having to necessarily give anything up. That's the other thing. I don't want to give up my hot shower every day. I don't want to give up whatever, be able to get fresh produce, all that, whatever it is that makes your life comfortable or good, But I also recognize that, 7 billion people can't have hot showers every day. So how do we rectify all this? How do we find a better balance?
And that's a good question. And one of the first things I learned living in Japan was how they are more efficient, and they use, I think their carbon footprint is about 50% of the U.S. So, for example, I'm sitting in a room. This is the only room cooled in the house. In the wintertime, it's the only heated room. Heated toilet seats seem extravagant, lavish, but when you consider the bathroom itself is not heated and only the seat is, then it takes on a different character. But I mean, it's interesting that I think that humans are a clever species. I was kind of hoping that people were getting a little bit more worried. As a Californian, and I have a history I'm bi-coastal. I was born in New York, and we can talk a bit about New Jersey next. I think Californians are getting worried. My cousin's house almost burnt down in 2003, and the top 15 fires in California history have happened mostly within the last 10 years. So hopefully, now the New Jersey work is fascinating. My family history goes back to New York. My grandfather worked in New Jersey, so I know all about Newark, and you see improvements. For example, Staten Island, Arthur Kill was on fire in the 60s. Now you see people, fishermen now. Actually, until you showed me your trailer, I was not aware that Newark was still in such bad shape. This is multi-generational pollution problems. A lot of these other places, they've offshored to China and they're just kind of sitting there. So how did you get involved in that? I know you live in Montclair, it's not far away, but still people just kind of accept it as a feature of the landscape. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we live 6 miles away from the Ironbound, but we might as well be in a different planet. We live in a beautiful old, suburban community, trees and wooden houses and all that. So, it's really, my wife, Julie, that she received a grant to do work on this film, and then for 2 years she taught at Rutgers University in Newark about environmental justice. And so she was really the catalyst for this. And for me, it was just like, I'm all in to work on this because I recognize how important it is. And also there's something about working on like hyper-local stories of global or national or global significance that are really attractive to me at this stage. And where you might feel like you can make more of a difference, so what's going on? Well, one good thing in New Jersey is apparently the mayor, Raz Baraka, who's a son of the city, he was able in 2 years to get all of the lead lined water pipes changed. So that's a great story, positive story, where when you have the political will and you have the unity of a community, or a city in this case, and they come together and they have the technical ability and they get the job done. And so now Newark has gone from a Flint, Michigan-like situation to where I'm not saying everything's perfect with their water, but at least they've ameliorated this one, cause of lead pollution, which leads to so many other problems in terms of human development with our kids and all that. So, I do feel that there is an awakening going on. There's no question about it. The environmental justice movement, I don't know how old it is, maybe from the 70s, I believe, but it's definitely taking on a new tenor and a new energy. And, this film, my wife's film that we've created, is an example of that. And she's had so many screenings in the last year, most of them virtual, where she has reached, tens of thousands of people now, just through that alone. And, we're watching the film being purchased by high schools and colleges to be shown. So, those are the kind of, talk about shadow play. Those are the kinds of things that aren't going to make, CNN or New York Times headlines. But that's where the change takes place. You wake up young minds. Yep.
They should be reporting on it, though. They should definitely be reporting on it. No, I love that and I think that the U.S. in general, a lot of times for the longest time we were looking at the outside world is where the problems are and we've got it great at home. But now people are starting to say, let's look closer to home at what's happening here. And I think that you guys are doing great work that way. Just to kind of bring it back around, I listened to a couple of interviews of yours that going back a few years, and in 2014 you said something about, you mentioned climate change back then. It's not that long ago, but how has your understanding of this issue evolved in the interim, in those 7 years, do you think?
Oh, I think I'm just more alarmed, and I feel more inspired and motivated to shift my focus in my personal work to stories that revolve around it. So the chronic kidney disease project, which is not finished, we want to morph that into a series of short documentaries about heat stress among workers around the world. So basically it's just increased my sense of urgency that these are stories that my work can possibly have impact on. Back in the early 90s, I had the hubris of, I will go to the Muslim world to tell stories to bridge the gap between Islam and the West. It's like, well, I didn't do a very good job, did I? But I'm just saying that that's the hubris of youth, but it's also, also things I was genuinely interested in. Whereas now at this stage in my life and in my career, it's more about, let's get real. What can I actually work on where there can maybe be impact, so that my energy, my talent, my skill, my knowledge, whatever it is I possess can be dedicated to something that will bring positive change to the world. Because that is what motivates me. It's really simple. It's having a sense of purpose. And so to answer your question and connect them to, I get a great sense of purpose now trying to tell stories around climate.
Well, and as I said, I love the way that you bring people into it. Try to tell too complex a story, too abstract, and people are going to kind of be left in the weeds on it. But you bring a family into it, and suddenly people are like, that reminds me of my uncle. that's something that we went through. And suddenly people can kind of grasp it in a real world sort of, it ceases to be abstract. So I think we're going to see more of those stories in the northern mid latitudes, and people hopefully will start, getting it and getting a little bit more urgency. So anyway, Ed, I really appreciate you sharing this work. Please keep doing what you're doing. I know you will. It's important work, and I think that the other thing is we have to have this deep passion, because it isn't headline news. This is it's going to be buried in the magazine, but it actually, at the end of the day, it's more important than the hot adrenaline burning stuff. So thank you very, very much for joining me, and thank you for all of the help and advice and the posting on everyday climate change, because it really has benefited.
Yeah, well, James, thank you for inviting me to do this, but also for what you've created. It's a global, the Everyday Climate Change Instagram feed is part of a global movement that cuts across every barrier or designation in humanity, national, religious, gender, so forth and so on, and brings people together around this one critical issue. So thank you for doing that.